Culture, and welcome to episode number 5 of Ancient Landscapes with myself, Tine. In this 6-part series, I will be selecting some of my favourite landscapes in Ireland's ancient East and taking a journey back through the ages to uncover some of their hidden mysteries. We'll explore the ruins of some of our most famous landmarks and the myths and legends which reside there, with interviews from experts and amateur enthusiasts alike to guide us along the way. In this episode, we'll travel 6 kilometres northwest of Dundalk town to Roach Castle, one of Ireland's most impressive Norman ruins, and one of few castles here to have been built by a woman. From there, we will try to untangle some of Dundalk's fascinating Norman history, as it related to the castle's builder and her wider family tree. This family was the De Verduns, one of the earliest and least remembered Norman families to have arrived in Ireland with the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169. When we think of the Normans invading Ireland, it's easy to imagine a massive, uninvited army and their ships docking in East Coast ports and taking the country by force. This isn't exactly what happened, however. The Normans initially arrived, in fact, at the invitation of an Irishman named Diarmaid MacMurrough. MacMurrough had been a king of Leinster for the better part of 30 years, right up until 1166, when he was deposed by the newly crowned High King of Ireland, Ruaidhrí O'Connor, an old enemy of his. Feeling rather lucky to have escaped with his life, MacMurrough fled to Bristol in England on the 1st of August that year to offer his fealty to King Henry II of England and to seek allies in regaining his lands and title in Leinster. Henry agreed and gave him permission to recruit from amongst his barons in Wales. One of those who would offer his support to MacMurrough was Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, who had an uneasy relationship with King Henry, to say the least. In 1167, Diarmaid MacMurrough returned to Ireland with a small retinue of his new supporters and claimed back his kingdom, High Kinsella, which centred around Ferns in County Wexford. In the preceding 2 years, more Anglo-Norman troops arrived to help MacMurrough maintain his tenuous hold on the kingship, and in 1170, Strongbow arrived to assist him in expanding his kingdom to Dublin City. This helped to line things up for MacMurrough to become High King of all Ireland, but unfortunately he died before this was achieved in 1171. Strongbow, who had married MacMurrough's eldest daughter Aoife and who had been promised Diarmaid's title upon his death, carried on in the face of adversity with the aim of consolidating his newly won kingdom. However, just when Strongbow thought the day was won, England's Henry II, who thought his subject was getting a little too big for his boots, arrived, backed by the Catholic Church and an army of 4,000 in County Waterford, and demanded submission from Strongbow and his allies. It was time to claim all of this newly acquired land for the English crown, and that is just what he did. It's at this point in our story that Bertram de Verdun first appears. His family had originally hailed from Avranchamp in Normandy, France, and his grandfather had travelled to England during the Norman invasion of 1066, where he had won lands around Buckinghamshire. His son had then built upon his father's legacy and gained further tracts of land in Leicestershire and Staffordshire. But it was Bertram de Verdun III who worked his way into the position of trusted advisor to King Henry II. The king brought him to Ireland as his seneschal in charge of provisions and stores when he travelled to Ireland to assert his kingship over Strongbow in October of 1171. For his allegiance and role in the Irish campaign, Bertram was to receive a handsome royal grant from King Henry of substantial lands in the Kingdom of Oriel, namely Dundalk and Drogheda towns, along with several other castles. Dundalk's most powerful family, the O'Carrolls, had submitted to King Henry, and so there was no opposition put up when Bertram set about building a manor house for himself in the old town centre of Dundalk, known as Castle Mount or Dundalk, and nowadays known as Cuchulain's Castle. Bertram's original structure was likely made from timber in the Mott and Bailey style, which is so often seen in Norman strongholds, although no real remnants of it survive today. What we can still see, however, was the strategic importance of the structure's position, sitting high on a hill with commanding views over the Castletown River and the Gap of the North. The mount was also close to Tuberona, where travellers heading north or southwards would have had to ford the Castletown River in order to continue on their journey. Bertram had also ordered the building of a particularly large motte, which is often seen in areas of military tension. Another strategic construction by Bertram was Dundalk's first friary and hospital named St. Leonard's and located in Seatown. It has been memorialised in the name of St. Leonard's Garden behind the old library. It's unlikely that Bertram actually spent any considerable time in Dundalk, since he remained close to Henry II in all his undertakings until the end of his life, and afterwards became an influential figure with his successor, King Richard I. He eventually died in Jaffa in 1192. Although he had many sons, it was Bertram's son Nicholas who seemed to have led an otherwise unremarkable life, yet who produced the heir who would later inherit Bertram's lands around County Louth. That heir was a daughter named Rohesia, who married Ireland's Theobald de Butler in 1223 at the urgent recommendation of England's King Henry III. It's understandable, considering England's new and somewhat shaky hold on Ireland, that the king would want this powerful and independent Anglo-Norman woman to marry into a trusted and titled family. Theobald was the son of Theobald Walter, who had been named the first Chief Butler of Ireland. He had also held the title of Chief Butler of England and High Sheriff of Lancashire. His uncle was the Archbishop of Canterbury and Justiciar and Lord Chancellor of England. Butler, which the family would later take as their surname, was an honorary role which involved giving the king his first cup of wine after his coronation. In addition, a portion of all the wine which arrived in Irish ports was to be allotted to the person holding this title. Although Theobald the Younger, who was named the second Chief Butler of Ireland after his father's death, would have been a very wealthy and influential candidate for marriage, Rohesia de Verdun was not about to give up her independence that easily. For both herself and Theobald, it was their second time to marry, which meant that Rohesia's children were not entitled to inherit their father's lands and holdings upon his death. They were, however, entitled to inherit their mother's estate, provided she maintained her own surname. And this, of course, is exactly what she did. Despite only having been married for 8 years upon the death of her husband in 1230 in Poitou, France, Rohesia managed to produce 4 children, the eldest of which was a son named John. Rohesia, it seems, was determined to expand and maintain her family legacy, a part of which was the great castle she built just outside of Dundalk. Ireland in the 1200s was a volatile place. Severe weather was causing considerable disruption to the natural rhythms of the seasons, and as a result, famine, sickness and starvation were widespread, as well as innumerable struggles for power right across the island. The competition for resources was relentless, and even the mighty Anglo-Norman forces weren't immune. The de Verduns, as the most powerful Norman family in the newly established frontier town of Dundalk, would have required considerable security from frequent raids, and despite its strategic location, Bertram's timber motte bailey wouldn't have stood much of a chance against a starving and fierce onslaught of Gaels arriving from the north. So after her husband died and Bertram's granddaughter Rohesia decided to return to her lands in Ireland, she would have needed to begin construction of something far more substantial. Local legends tell us that Rohesia offered her hand in marriage and a portion of her wealth to the man who could design her an impenetrable castle. Then, upon its subsequent completion and her marriage to the successful architect, she invited him to survey his new estate from the high window of their bridal suite and subsequently pushed him to his death. Although there is a tantalising and perilous corridor in Roach Castle from which one could easily imagine falling to one's death, it's not connected to any chamber which might be described as a bridal suite. It's here that the legend begins to unravel somewhat. Our next clue as to the story's veracity was the fact of Rohesia's legal standing. Having been recently widowed, Rohesia decided to pay a fine of almost €10 million in today's money for the status of femme seule, meaning she could inherit from her father and husband and remain unmarried afterwards. Whilst it's possible that this was done in secret upon her return from France, it seems unlikely that one of the most powerful women in 13th century Ireland would have been able to consolidate her status as a single woman without anyone finding out and warning off any potential suitors who might have tendered for the role of husband and chief architect. Not to mention the already fierce reputation Rohesia must have had. It was noted at the time that she wore armour and acted like a man, and apparently even rode into battle against her enemies, the O'Hanlons. In addition to this, her newly built castle, a blatant display of power to those in the surrounding areas, would have drawn much unwanted attention from raiders and schemers alike. Built on a natural rocky outcrop with steep drops on all sides, the triangular structure was separated from the village that sustained it by a rock-cut ditch and a large gatehouse flanked by two equally large barrel-shaped towers. An unusual feature which can still be seen in the castle's Great Hall are the large arched windows which overlook the landscape to the south of the structure. Being positioned so high above the ground below, these windows would not have posed the same threat that they may have done in other Norman structures. At the centre of the structure there also remains what appears to be a well, which would have provided water in times of siege. Unlike most other Norman castles, there are no signs of any later additions or changes to the castle, and there's no evidence of post-medieval habitation. Before Rohesia's eldest son John had come of age to inherit, Rohesia found herself once again feeling the political pressure to remarry and secure her considerable holdings with a respected husband. This time, she decided instead to build Grace-Dieu, a priory in Leicestershire, England, and went there to establish and join an independent sect known as the White Nuns of St. Augustin, in order to ensure her son would inherit the legacy she had built and preserved for him once he came of age. She died in her 40s in England on the 10th of February 1247. Her son John's contribution to the de Verdun legacy in Dundalk was the building of a Franciscan abbey, the tower of which remains today and is referred to as Seatown Castle. Roach Castle remained with the de Verdun family for 2 more generations until it was finally left to 4 de Verdun sisters, Joan, Elizabeth, Marjorie and Isabel. The women all married English husbands and, due to their absenteeism as landlords, Castle Roach was eventually lost to the de Verduns. It changed hands several times over the next century and was eventually bought by Sir John Bellew. There is little trace of the de Verdun family in Dundalk apart from John's name on the plaque of Seatown Castle and the uniquely impressive ruin of his mother's castle at Roach. Yet so much of Dundalk's landscape can be attributed to their time here. I had a chat with artist and amateur historian John Kerr, who first came southwards to visit Roach Castle in order to photograph it at the recommendation of a friend a few years back. What he saw when he arrived sparked an intensive period of study into Ireland's Anglo-Norman history, including the history of Roach Castle and the de Verdun family. But first, I wanted to ask him about Dundalk's other major Norman influencer and contemporary of Bertram de Verdun, John de Courcy.
In 1177 then, John de Courcy, he had sort of said to Henry, "Oh, can I take Ulster?" And Henry sort of didn't really give a straight answer, but said, "Well, if you manage to win it, then let me know and we'll talk about it then. We'll see what happens." He didn't really like giving straight answers or being held to his word.
Yes.
John de Courcy then, he was eager for lands, he was eager for his own destiny and power. He was a warrior, a Norman knight, and so he gathered together I think 20 or 30 knights and maybe 300 or 400 Flemish bowmen, Welsh bowmen and builders and stuff. And then they left Dublin, came up through Meath with safe passage. Now, John de Courcy must have had Irish information on his side to know where to go and where to attack. So he came up and he went around the Mourne Mountains and went to Downpatrick and he sacked Erdana Abbey. The army of MacDunleavy seen this fighting force and knew they couldn't win, and basically they weren't prepared, so they ran away. The Irish were no match really for them at all. Then de Courcy took the bishop prisoner and took the holy relics and then give them back at a later time. But that was MacDunleavy deposed and lost. But interestingly enough, de Courcy then also built along with the Verdun Dundalk, and the part of the town, I believe, called Tine. He also fought in the Louth area, and there's a passage about him then coming to the plain of Louth and stealing all the cattle and heading back up north to Downpatrick. And there at Glenree, which I believe is probably Newry, he was ambushed by Mura O'Carroll, the king of Louth, and Cooley MacDunleavy, the king of Downpatrick, the Dalfia kingdom, and basically his army were wiped out in the river, and he was lucky to escape, but made his way back to Dublin and recovered and got reinforcements and came back up north to fight again another day.
I then asked John how he came to have such an interest in Dundalk's Norman history, particularly that of Roach Castle.
I guess it started whenever I arrived at this castle 2 years ago, and I fell in love with the place. I was just in awe of the size and the build and the lack of history. Whenever I looked it up on the internet, there was very, very little information, and so I decided, well, what is the actual real story behind the castle? What is the whole story? So I've spent months looking through the annals, looking through whatever records and books and whatever anybody else had said, and tied 2 or 3 storylines together to see what happened at a certain time, and whenever the Bruce invasion was here, and whenever the castle was built, and what happened to it in its later days, or what went on before, why was it built here, and what's the story with the whole area, and the Normans coming to County Louth and Dundalk, and what they built and what they fought.
Yes, indeed. Modern visitors to Roach, even 800 years after it was built, are still awestruck at the castle's beauty, its striking defensive features and its unquestionable dominance over the rolling green landscape in which it sits. I wanted to ask John more about the process of building it and the resources which would have been required for the job.
It was a major feat to build a castle. It would have taken hundreds and hundreds of men. First of all, you would have needed the major architect, and he would have planned out the castle. He would have organised the stonemasons, and it would have taken a lot of wood to build the scaffolding. It would have taken a lot of quarrymen to start and dig the stone and then cut the stone level. Then it needed a crane, a medieval crane.
Tell us about that.
A medieval crane was, if you like a big hamster wheel, which was maybe 8 or 10 feet in diameter, and it would have had a couple of men standing, and they walked, which made the wheel turn, which made a smaller wheel turn, and it had a rope then going up to a hoist, and that hoisted up each large stone, and it would have been put into place. When it was in place then, they made plaster. They would have had to quarry the lime. They would have needed a large furnace, the lime kiln, and it was mixed with cement. The master mason then would have said, right, we need cement for the stone. There was different types of cement for plastering the walls and for sticking the walls together and stuff. They built the outside, they built the inside, and then they put filler, all the small stones into the centre to make their 4 foot wide walls. And they would have used weights hanging on ropes to keep everything level, and they would have used T-squares and kept it all level, kept it straight so that it wasn't being built at an angle. But it was a huge, huge task, and certainly they would have had maybe 2 or 3 blacksmiths making all the metal work, making the doors, making the hinges and the doors and the bolts, making the roof beams. I think with this castle too, over the walls on the outside was like a wooden palisade, and things would have been dropped down on attackers. and that was a major part of the defence of this castle now. So there was a hell of a lot of wood went into it. I mean, they used axes and saws. There was no chainsaws. There was no industrial thing. It was a huge task to build a castle like this, involving hundreds and hundreds of men at a time, and it must have cost a fortune.
Whilst researching Roach Castle, I found it much easier to get information on its builder Rohesia and her immediate family members. As for what had happened to it after her death, well, I was really hoping John could help me out a bit on that front. This place stayed in her family for a century or two after that, was it?
Until the mid-1300s.
Yes.
When basically the male line of the family had died out, and basically I think it was another John de Verdun or Nicholas, and he had 4 daughters, and the castle then was left to the one called Maud. She married Baron Furnivall, and it stayed with the family for another 50 or 60 years, was then bought by John Ballou. There's a note in annals of John applying for a grant for castle repairs around the mid-1400s or so. They also had a manor then closer to Dundalk, and they also I think had a manor around Drogheda.
Before we wrapped up the history of Roach Castle, I wanted to know what John thought about the stories pertaining to one of its famous visitors, Edward de Bruce, who arrived in Dundalk less than 70 years after Rohesia's death, and, according to the stories, was supposedly responsible for destroying Roach Castle. De Bruce had been able to take Carrickfergus town, but not Carrickfergus Castle, and so it seemed odd to me that he would have been able to successfully lay siege to a castle as well fortified as Roach, and equally that so few details of this should survive, especially when the castle went on to play host to English forces in the 16th century and was said to also have been destroyed by Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. Indeed, there are holes in the front facade which John attributes to cannon fire, so what part did Edward de Bruce actually play here?
It says now that he attacked this castle. I tend to doubt it. He didn't have any siege materials, he didn't have trebuchets or anything. If anything, I would guess that he maybe attacked the bailey out there and stole whatever he could. He then went into the dock and burnt the friary and went to Athlone and burnt a church full of nuns and priests. But interesting enough now, in the final battle of Fogard, Nicholas and Miles de Verdun are mentioned as being commanders under John de Birmingham and helping in the battle to defeat de Bruce and claim the glory from that. And there's a record then of Miles de Verdun surviving and applying to the king then for a grant for his lands, that his horses and his provisions had been stolen.
Even though, according to available records, the de Verdun family was only active in Ireland for a couple of centuries, their legacy still stands and has become an integral part of Dundalk's history. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient landscapes, I'd like to give thanks to you for joining us and to John Kerr for his insight and research into Roach Castle and the de Verdun family. Be sure to tune in next time for our last episode in the series, where we will visit another de Verdun stronghold and reputed home of the Pirate Burn at Cuchulain's Castle. We'll be speaking to local man Damien Callan, who remembers the last person to have lived on the mount itself, and we'll hear his account of what it was like growing up in the shadow of Dundalk's most famous and ancient landmark. Thanks to David Bellew on sound and to Dundalk FM for their support in making this programme. I've been your host, Tara Tine, and these are our ancient landscapes.